Admitting more people in. Well, as we have more people joining, thank you so much to everyone who is joining this breakout session, and thank you for the invitation for us to present some of our work at the Consumer Choice Center. My name is Bill Wirtz. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Consumer Choice Center. I'm joined today by Maria Chaplia, who is our, oh gosh, Maria, tell me your exact title again.
European Affairs Associate.
European Affairs Associate. I'm always mixing up the Senior Associate and Affairs. And there is also Fabio Fernandes, who is our Media Associate, right? I'm always bad.
Exactly. Hi, everyone.
And Fabio sounds a lot better than me. He's got all the radio set up. Fortunately, I'm here only with headphones. I'll be taking us through the different topics that the Consumer Choice Center is working on. And feel free to ask questions along the way. We are open to discuss everything. Our official topic for today is, of course, consumer policies post-COVID-19. For us, there isn't too many changes in what bad regulation we think that ought to be overturned as a result of COVID-19, as opposed to what ought to be overturned prior to COVID-19. So I have a few topics we want to get to. And so first of all, you should, of course, follow us on social media. That's Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all the classics. consumerchoicecenter.org is our website where you can find all of our recent publications. We have a lot of work that we have done throughout the course of these lockdowns and pandemics, and so you can follow that content as regularly as you would like. And I'd like to first start with Maria. Now, Maria, you did some recent work on the topic of the sharing economy, and I'll ask you a few questions to sort of guide the conversation. But first of all, we hear the sharing economy, and oftentimes we think of Uber. So we think about taxis, but it's actually a lot more in the sharing economy. Just give us a few examples that you came across your research. What kinds of sharing economy is out there?
Oh, thank you. Hi, everyone. Very happy to be here. Yeah, to start with, well, we at the Consumer Choice Center talk a lot about consumer choice, and we cover a wide area of topics. And yesterday, I had a situation related to the sharing economy, which explains why consumer choice matters a lot. I wanted to take a taxi in Kiev, Ukraine, which is one of the top cities judging by our sharing economy index. And you can pick from 4 alternatives. And it's so cool because you have Uber, you have Bolt, then there's some 2 other apps, I forgot the names of, but it's amazing. There's so much to choose from. And then you have Airbnb, which is also, flight sharing is also one of the key parts of our sharing economy index. Then you also have gym sharing apps. Then you can see people all over Kiev using e-scooters, which is also something we looked at as part of our sharing economy index. And we also looked at carpooling apps. For example, there's this Uber Shuttle now, but it's not just Uber. There's also various, like, of course, we all know BlaBlaCar, but there's other apps. There's like, there are some apps, I forgot the actual names, but you can open our sharing economy index and find so many interesting apps in there. It's just amazing. If you go to any country, like you go to islands, you want to spend some time in Dublin, you just open our sharing economy index, you click on the carpooling app, and you see all of those new apps. And yes, and we looked at all of those apps, and we were trying to compile all of this data for consumers, but not just for consumers, because I think the key part of our index is also that it covers not just availability of some services, but also access to those services. So as I mentioned, in Kiev, you can become an Uber driver or a Bolt driver without any kind of special license. You can just wake up in the morning or sign up in an app and be a taxi driver for a day. It's impossible in France, for example, where you need to have a special kinds of license. And as far as I remember, almost in every EU country, you just need to get some. Estonia is different, which is our leader, which is the top 10 sharing economy friendly city by our index. But yeah, you don't need special license, so you can see access. Same applies to Airbnb. There's all sorts of taxes, and there's also licenses. And what we found out during our research for the index is that the fields of sharing economy is going to become more and more regulated. But it's also one of the reasons is that traditional taxi apps or traditional renting, flat sharing, flat renting, they feel some kind of competition, and they go to the streets or they just raise up their voices against this. And what governments would supposed to do, we would love it to do, is to decrease regulation, but it wants to make the level of regulation the same, which makes things worse. And I mean, there's of course a lot more to share, but Elizabeth ask some more questions.
Yes. Well, so what Maria is describing here is our sharing economy index, which is the first of its kind, because there were previous indices that were looking at the regulation of the sharing economy, but what we did is we combined the availability, which is often the reason, like why, like the availability is how to say, like the regulation governs the availability of certain sharing economy services. We saw that during the pandemic, people needed sharing economy products when it comes to food delivery, when it also comes to getting around the city where buses sometimes were not as available anymore. So give us some overview of the cities that performed very well, and sort of why you think specifically those cities are so, like, are less stringent on regulation towards the gig economy by comparison to the rest of Europe.
It's a great question. So one of the most surprising findings of the index was that post-communist countries perform very well in terms of sharing economy, like St. Peter's cities also. So it's Moscow, St. Petersburg, Tallinn, Riga, Kiev, Vilnius. All of those cities are some of the most consumer friendly when it comes to sharing economy. And I mean, why is a great question, because, well, I think the reason why those cities perform so well is because those countries, which you wouldn't expect them to be, they have so little trust for government that all of the economy is happening more on a peer-to-peer level. They trust their neighbor more than they trust some big government. So it's better for them to couple with their neighbor than expect government to come up with some suitable tendency to help them figure out their commute. And it's interesting in this sense, but also taxation is much lower. For example, in Ukraine, there's no flat sharing tax, no Airbnb tax. In Italy, there is an Airbnb tax. And there's also in Paris, there's a city tax, a tourist tax. And you have to pay so many taxes that, I mean, the industry gets so overwhelmed and the whole consumer surplus just drops. This is bad, but I think the problem is that in the post-consumer countries, sharing economy is still something new, and governments I think they just haven't had time to delve into it and to regulate it, but I think the time will come.
Right. I remember when I was early this year, I was staying at an Airbnb in Berlin, and then I came in and I had to fill out 2 pages of forms with all my information. They asked me to fill that out because Airbnb is considered an hotel type business. Can you give me some examples as to like what restrictions exist towards the sharing economy services? How does government make life difficult for both the users and those who offer the services on sharing economy platforms?
I think one of the biggest problems is the need to have a special permit to either become a taxi driver for Uber or Bolt, or to rent out your flat as an Airbnb service. There's so many licenses in Paris, in Germany, almost everywhere across the EU. There's many countries where you have to fill out so many documents just to get. Also, there's this new thing, you have to go to a city council to register as someone who wants to rent out your flat as on Airbnb. So I think that's one of the biggest problems, because those are all transactions costs, and it takes lots of time, and then you sort of think twice before renting out your flat in Airbnb. Then you also have to pay taxes, as I mentioned, like city tax, tourist tax. There's also some kinds of rental taxes. There were many countries where there were taxes, and then another restriction is that some governments are planning to limit the number of days you can rent out your property on Airbnb. Prague is considering this. I think they want to have some kind of regulation that says that you can only rent out your flat for 60 days a year or something. And it's the same in Netherlands. There's lots of those kinds of regulations. In terms of Uber, the same applies. You need to have a special permit to get a taxi driver's license if you want to become a Bolt driver. But it's ridiculous, because Uber is supposed to be a peer-to-peer economy, and it's all built on trust. You're not supposed to have this taxi driver's permit, because if you're supposed to have this permit, then it's not Uber, it's more like a traditional taxi service. So what's the point? So that's sort of weird in this sense, and we, of course, at the Consumer Choice Center would love to see governments moving away from those regulations and just let all of this develop on trust as it goes, and let consumers decide what they want, whether they want to go for traditional services or for sharing economy.
Right. We have a question here asking, how do these Airbnb regulations compare to those that hotels must follow? Now, of course, that's a very general question. It depends country by country, but give us some overview as to what you found out in your research.
We didn't look at this specifically in terms of Airbnb, but what we did look at is how those regulations compare for Uber drivers to those for taxi drivers. And if you want to become a taxi driver, you don't just need to have a taxi driver's license. You also need to have a certain number of years you worked as a taxi driver, and then you have to pay some amount in tax to apply for this. It's a very long procedure. Luckily for Uber drivers and Bolt drivers, it's still more or less liberalized, but I don't know. I think it's going to get worse. I hope it won't, but judging by so many protests from taxi drivers, it doesn't seem good.
Right.
But it's a great idea to look at how those compare to hotels. Thank you.
So to my understanding, I think the reason why they do some of these registration requirements is because they want to levy the same taxes. So, for instance, in some cities in Europe now, I don't know how this compares internationally because I'm not as well traveled as I'd like to be, but I know that in some European cities there's tourist taxes, there's local taxes that you need to pay. Now, in hotels, these are levied easily because an hotel has an official registration, but for Airbnb, that doesn't exist. But I do know, for example, that there would be maybe that's an outlier, because I'm traveling to Serbia actually tomorrow afternoon, and in Belgrade I was told that my Airbnb host will levy a special local tax, a tourist tax that they have to. Now, I'm not sure this is new, and last time I traveled to Belgrade that was not the case. Maybe this is a new provision, but in any way, it's they try more and more to adapt these services to the legacy providers. Now, Maria, let me maybe play a little devil's advocate here. Isn't it great that the government is regulating these services because the workers are being exploited? You know, these are involuntary freelancers. They have to cover their own social security and so on. Like, isn't it great that the unions are coming in and helping us regulate these services, because otherwise these workers would never get any protection?
Yeah, it also answers the question about why sharing economy is so popular in post-communist countries, because there's not enough government's control of what's happening. There's a funny story about the sharing economy ethics. I was reading about Airbnb in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and I stumbled upon some forums where consumers were talking to each other about Airbnb, flat sharing licenses and whatever. And people from Russia, they were saying, we need some regulation. There's not enough regulation. Everything that's happening here is just chaos, anarchy. We need someone to step in and regulate this. But then, I mean, it sort of makes sense on one hand, because you would like to see what's happening in that fields of economy, especially once it grows and becomes so popular and attracts so many people to it. But then on the other hand, I mean, they had to pay VAT. So for our index, we didn't count VAT and income tax as taxes. We looked at some additional taxes like tourist tax, city tax, and all of those things. And I think VAT, income tax, they are more than enough. And then city tax, and in the case of Uber, for example, there's motor vehicle tax, CO2 emissions tax, and all of those weird taxes that I don't think that governments levy them for the sake of. I think they just levy them to have more money and to then increase some social security spending, but it's not for the sake of just regulating the industry and to see what's going on there. Ideally, it's sharing economy was supposed to be spontaneous, so there's no need to regulate it. It just goes against all of its nature to regulate it and to try to intervene. So that's my point.
I think it also provides a great, it's also a new service in a way that workers get the opportunity to only work a certain amount of time. It gives an enormous flexibility to only work 2 hours or just 1 hour, depending on your whatever you feel like. So from that perspective, also the workers have more flexibility. But we do have another question. Here's Darren, who says Australian taxi plates for cars, and he says specifically in Sydney, got up to nearly $1 million Australian dollars before Uber came in. Did the countries you studied have similar issues of huge economic rents created by forced scarcity? So sort of like, how did the system work prior to Uber, or does it actually conjointly with Uber still exist today, these licenses? Like, what are the different examples you saw in European countries that we analyzed?
Yeah, I think the fact that once Uber or Bolt, they entered the market, taxi drivers were so outraged by the competition. It shows that they were enjoying some kinds of monopoly in that field. So even though it was hard to get in, to become a taxi drivers, I didn't come across any change of regulation in how to become a taxi driver or something. It all stays the same, I think, for 10 or 5 years. So nothing changed there. It's more like the government changed regulations for Uber and Bolt, which, I mean, is sort of an effort to make them all equal, but not so much. So I think for taxi drivers, what changed is that they now have to adapt to the fact that they have some competitor, which is not a traditional industry too. So in that sense, yes, it did change for them, but everything else, not so much.
There were also some compromises. So at the beginning, when France was moving against Uber and other services, we thought that this was going to be the end of the sharing economy in Europe, and that some services were going to be outlawed. But there also were some compromise solutions. Can you tell me a bit about, not sure if this might be too technical, but there's some VTC regulation which created like a compromise between taxi licenses and completely free market. Can you tell me, like, how were they able to solve some of the issues in cities like Paris and Brussels?
I didn't look at this in great detail, but I think it's for Uber drivers, they have to have VTC too. And I think one of the differences is that in Paris specifically, as far as I remember, is that Uber drivers are exempt from paying motor vehicle tax. So while taxi drivers have to pay this tax, so I think that's one of the key differences. But Paris is, I was surprised to find out that Paris was more or less, compared to other European cities, it was still not the most regulated city when it comes to sharing economy. I mean, in Paris you still have not just Uber. As far as I remember, there's also Bolt and something else. In many cities, there's nothing. Like in Greece, there's Uber taxi, which is a yellow taxi, a traditional taxi, but you can order it by using your Uber app, which is very weird. But I guess in a way we can call this a compromise too, because it has the name of something related to sharing economy, but it's not sharing economy.
Well, at least it does give you the advantage of being able to see where your ride is going and being able to use your phone and pay by credit card, which was an innovation by comparison to, I mean, some countries in the world still, I mean, Germany is very bad on this. You know, in Germany, you still can't pay by card if you want to just use a taxi. So a lot of convenience added to that. Well, Maria, are you gonna update the index next year? What's the plan? Is there more happening, and how is it going forward? Or like, how to say? Maybe a better way to say it was like, are you optimistic that sharing economy services are going to be more available in the future?
I would like to think so, but looking at some countries like Czech Republic I mentioned, and there was some other cities, I think it was somewhere in the US, there were again protests, once again, because sharing economy was sort of helping ease all the damage from the COVID-19. And so they were helping people. So I think that there's going to be more on that front. But I hope to update the index next year to see how things are going to get better, get worse. It's all very exciting. I will probably look for the next year's index at hotel regulations to see how those compare with Airbnb. It was a great idea. Thank you. Thank you to have asked me this question. It was very helpful.
Well, thank you. In order to get through this hour, of course, and bring everyone in, I think we're going to move away from sharing economy for a bit now. Just one point. I see somebody asking, first of all, how do Australians seek asylum in Europe? Unfortunately, I don't think it's that easy, especially right now, to come to Europe. And also, what other services? I think Maria was able to list a few. There's gym sharing economy. There's also, of course, food delivery, and there's
No food delivery. No, we didn't look at food delivery. No, e-scooters. We looked at e-scooters, car sharing, carpooling apps, and rental car apps, and peer-to-peer car rental apps, car sharing apps, and e-scooters. Yeah, and pledge sharing and ride-hailing. That's all.
A lot related to transport, indeed. But maybe we're going to see more in the future. I know that there's some projects in London that even try to do it with tools, because for myself, I do not own a hammer. I would love if there was a place where I could actually get a hammer just for 2-3 hours, which would be, I think, both more environmentally friendly and more efficient, actually, because it would cost me less money than actually buying a hammer for myself. So maybe there's a lot more to see in the future, and we'll see how the government is going to react to all of those. But as we talk about mobility, we'll be moving into some more mobility that's a bit more restricted at the moment, although I have been able to take a few planes. It has become increasingly difficult during COVID-19 to travel. But eventually we're going to get out of this pandemic. And then, of course, we want to know what are the best services to use and the best places to fly from. So here we have Fabio Fernandes. And Fabio looked at a different index. He looked at the Latin American Airport Index. Now, this is similar to something we've done before. So first of all, Fabio, just let us know a bit about what is the aim of this index and what does it tell consumers?
Hi, Bill. Thank you for having me here. So that's a great question. Actually, as you mentioned before, the Latin America Airport Index is a brother or sister of two other indexes that we did in the past. So in the beginning of this year, we did the European Railway Station Index. And last year, we did the same analysis of the airports, but this time for Europe. And why do we do those kind of reports and indexes as a consumer group? So I think our main purpose is, one, to help consumers identify and bring some quality when choosing. So we are all about choice, and we help them navigate some of maybe the airports and the railway stations, and with the sharing economy index, which cities, countries, airports, railway stations are the best and giving the best services and products to consumers. This is one of the reasons that we did that report. We think that consumers might like that, but it's important also to say, and that's the second point, that our critique sometimes with the bottom countries or cities or whatever that comes in our indexes are not specifically to the city or maybe to for the airport, in my case, for example. Sometimes it's a critique to the government and the legislation and things that do not help those airports, for example, gain some status and gain more points in the index. So being born in Brazil and living there many, many years, I think the Latin America Airport Index for me was very important, and very important to release this index this year with COVID-19. We know that COVID has created unprecedented low levels of air travel, and we are hopeful that by the end of this year, or maybe in the couple of next months, we can take again the skies and fly again. So this index will be very helpful for consumers to take a look in which airports in Latin America they can use to have a better service and a very better experience overall. I know that, for example, in my case in Brazil, we I think until the 2000s, most airports in Brazil were government owned. And things start to change after 2010 during the Dilma government, especially because of the Olympics and because of the international soccer competition. And we started privatizing some of the airports, and the most friendly airports in Brazil, so they are also in the top 10 for Latin America. Both of them are recently privatized. So that's, I think, an indication that private investment in airports is very good and very beneficial for consumers.
That sounds very promising. Now, what categories did you look at to evaluate the different airports? What does a good airport need in order to qualify?
That's a good question. We analyzed actually the 30 airports with the highest volume of passengers in Latin America. And then from these airports, we analyzed a series of things. For example, distance from the city center, ride-hailing availability, metro and railway station access, even national railway access would be additional points. We saw the number of flights, number of companies, direct flights, so availability of places to go. Also the number of shops, restaurants, lounges, and not only the number of them, but the ratio between the number of passengers of the airport and the number of services available. So for example, if you have not many shops or restaurants or lounges available, but you have a lot of high traffic for the airport, that seems probably some time of the day they are very crowded and not offering the best service and the best quality for the consumers and the passengers. Another thing that we analyze is the number of fingers, number of terminals, on-site hotels. So this guide, as we did for the Railway Index and the European Airport Index, are a very comprehensive guide for consumers and for air travelers. So that's something that if you're thinking of traveling the next couple of months, you should take a look at our indexes. They are very helpful to looking which airports are on the top of the index. And for example, for Latin America, we have the first airport, so the best one, which is the most friendly airport for passengers in Latin America. We have the Mexico airport, and then the one in the Mexico City. The second one is Ecuador. The third one is Brazil in São Paulo. Then Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Panama, Mexico again, Brazil again, this time with Rio de Janeiro, and then Colombia. So from the top 10, we have 8 countries. So Mexico and Brazil appears 2 times in that index. So kudos for them for being so well ranked.
I think indeed it's sometimes ignored by people that a travel experience is, not just getting into an empty hall and then eventually just flying out to your destination. It's because you actually spend quite a bit of time in airports, and it's good to have a positive experience there. And also when you have layovers, I've experienced quite a few very long layovers, and I would have loved that some of the airports would have had a better service. So as we found out, and then privatization is helping quite a bit with that effort. Now, Fabio, airlines, of course, are complaining quite a lot at the moment because they're not allowed to operate as they can before, and with that, airports are struggling themselves and the businesses in them. Can you just give us a few examples as to what we are suggesting as to how this problem can be alleviated, like how some of the airline industry and the associated industries can actually be helped without using massive amounts of taxpayer money to give them transfers?
Yes, of course. As I mentioned, one thing is we are signaling the airports. So if the airport is private owned, for example, they can do improvements. For example, give more shops and restaurants and create more lounge spaces. Those are things that create a more relaxing and more friendly situation for consumers. And it's important also to say that sometimes airports are one of the destinations. So for example, the airport in Dubai, so there are many airports around the world that are very famous for being a layover as one of a short destination before going to your final destination. So improving and investing in quality is something that airports are doing, especially in the past 10 years. They have been doing this very much. And that's one of the things that are, for the airport the index is very important to signaling to everybody. But the second thing is the government and consumers that use those airports can pressure their policymakers, their legislators, their politicians to make the changes necessary to maybe have a better service on those airports. For example, in São Paulo, one of the airports that is in the bottom 5, we have the Congonhas Airport, which is an airport located in the very heart, the center of São Paulo city. And this airport is waiting for 15 years for a monorail station that has been built for the past, I think, 6 or 7 years, but it's waiting for licensing and problems with the construction and everything. So, for example, it's not connected to the metro system. And even though it's in the heart of the city, it's not connected to any place rather than only buses. So that's something that performs very bad, but that is also something the airport cannot do anything about it. It's something that policymakers and also politicians have to deal with, and the society and consumers have to put pressure to have those implemented.
Exactly, and there's a lot to do now also to help the airline industry. I know that we've also put out a letter recently that gave some examples. Actually, a lot of countries have specific air passenger duties. So these are specific taxes that are levied on individual passengers that you have to pay. Now, I think all of us, when we've booked plane tickets online, have seen the long list of like the actual ticket price, and then comes the fees and the taxes before you see the end result, which can be quite staggering. And then, of course, there's local taxes and national taxes that are applied to it. And as opposed to levying these taxes and then doing massive transfers for these airlines with taxpayer money, it would make much more sense, administrative, bureaucratic sense, to reduce all these levies and taxes and fees in order to create a situation where people can actually use flights again. Now, Fabio, maybe eventually in closing, when it comes to air travel, a lot of people are saying that, you know, like, oh, there's all these airports and this convenience and so on, but it's not good for the environment. It's just like people just do it randomly. They fly to whatever destination. Can you tell a few things about like the impact of air travel, how important air travel is for certain groups in the population or like local destination? Maybe you have some examples from your home country that you would like to lay out to sort of illustrate why air travel is so significant.
Of course, you can speak much better than me regarding Europe and why those regulations and taxes and why there is this conception that air travel is bad for the environment, which we have seen that it's not. But I think it's a very Eurocentric conscious about air travel. I think in Latin America, since we have bad paved roads and sometimes roads that lead to nowhere, and we don't have a railway system that can connect. For example, Brazil is huge, and you can not travel efficiently to anywhere without air travel. So in this case, analyzing the airports is kind of taking a look and recognizing their air travel is very much important. And the way we travel and the places and the conditions of the airport of those cities. For example, we have cities that are very well populated with a small airport in terrible conditions that receives big flights. And this offers, of course, a terrible experience for the consumers. But this is the only airport available in a radius of maybe like 300 kilometers. So there is no other option for consumers in those areas to travel and to go anywhere without going through those airports. So that's why we think that this index is so important and so helpful to consumers.
Yes, I agree. I mean, we actually have the same situation in Europe when you look at central, well, more Eastern Europe, actually, where it's like the infrastructure, the road infrastructure and the rail infrastructure is just not appropriate for what people need. And sometimes people also look at this from the map, and they say like, well, we just make some high-speed rail, not ignoring that there might be like mountains in between that you have to sort of get over. So the reality of infrastructure hits hard, and we also see that new aircraft, new models actually have much more fuel efficiency, use a lot less fuel. So if we allow people to travel, we also allow companies to be able to reinvest profits into research and development and invest in aircraft that actually use less kerosene and are actually better for the environment. So I think that we can combine innovation and consumer-friendly consumer experience. So thank you, Fabio. I'll also note that we will have a new airport index for Europe as well, and that will be coming out in due time. Then, of course, I'd like to actually yield some time to myself, because I also have a topic I'd like to talk about, not related to mobility, actually a completely different topic, but concerns us all, because I think that everybody in this room eats on a regular basis. So if you do eat, you should be listening to this part, because I'll be talking to you very briefly about agriculture, which is a topic that I personally work on quite a bit. And of course, when we talk about agriculture, we talk about dealing with the problems that agriculture faces. The problems that agriculture faces, everything from water use to pests to different non-indigenous plants and seeds. We're dealing with wild animals. If you're in Europe and you're a farmer, wild boars are a big problem, of course. It can destroy your crops. In some areas of Europe, we even have wolves again. So all types of problems that agriculture faces. And I think one of the biggest problems that agriculture faces these days is environmentalism, because the modern environmentalist stream has been gotten very nostalgic about what agriculture ought to look like, and they have been very, very effective at influencing policymakers into buying into this narrative. So let me give you an example. So one of the words you'll hear a lot if you dive into the new environmentalist narrative on agriculture is agroecology. Now, agroecology initially was just the science of analyzing crops and soil development, but it's now moved into an actual ideology that propounds the idea of getting rid of modern tools for agriculture. So everything from crop protection, pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, no genetic engineering whatsoever. And in some cases, they don't even want to use mechanization. So modern tractors ought not to be used because we need to get back to something called peasant farming. Now, if you think this is the ideology of some crazy people, I'd actually have to disappoint you, because organizations such as the FAO, which is a body of the United Nations, is now actually sponsoring projects like this. So let me just explain to you how out of this world this perspective is. So the United Nations funds conferences, such as conferences in Nairobi, Kenya, to explain to local farmers that they should not use modern agricultural tools in their country. Now, Kenya is sometimes hit by some of the worst droughts in decades. Now is proposed a method of agriculture which, by admission of its own experts, reduces productivity by 30 to 35%. Now, I cannot for the life of me understand why my taxpayer money ought to go to organizations such as the FAO, which promote these agricultural practices. But this, of course, is a problem that is beyond just Africa. It also is a problem in North America. It is a particular problem in Europe. I'm not sure how much our Australian audience is aware or concerned about this topic, but I can tell you a few things about Europe. Let me just give a practical example from one of my recent papers. So I wrote this paper on mycotoxins. Now, mycotoxin, most people will actually know it rather as mold. You know, if you have vegetables lying in the fridge for a bit too long, you see some of these white weird particles on your vegetables. Now that's mold. Now you might say, well, this is something that can happen because I didn't store it well, and actually that's correct. Mold is created through bad food storage. And in mold, you have a development of something called mycotoxins, and you have a lot of subcategories of these mycotoxins. Now, why is this relevant? Now, this is relevant because it actually causes considerable health risks. 25% of all world liver cancers are related to aflatoxins, which is a kind of mycotoxin. And in Africa, it's up to 40%. Now, this is devastating for human health. And the way we've gotten actually rid of this problem in modern agriculture is fungicides. These are chemicals that we use. But of course, modern environmentalists don't want us to use any of these chemicals. So they say we need to phase out these chemicals and then just deal with the problem with, I don't know, nostalgic agriculture. I don't quite know. We at the Consumer Choice Center have said, now, the conversation on pesticides is very controversial, and understandably so, because spraying chemicals on food, it sounds counterintuitive. This is something you ought to do. What we do need to understand is that farmers do their due diligence on the use of these products, but also that if we would like to phase out certain chemical products, we can do that with modern technology. Genetic engineering, formerly more known as GMOs. Today, we're actually moving towards gene editing. This is where we edit specific strains of DNA in order to change the food that we're eating, but also we can actually use it for medical purposes. Genetic engineering gives us the possibility to circumvent the needs for synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and so on. It even also allows us to use less water and to create food that people with allergies don't react to. So if you have a nut allergy, we can already make nuts with gene editing that you won't react to. Make gluten-free wheat. We can do a bunch of things. We can also considerably reduce the amount of land that we need to grow all kinds of crops. So we have all these advancements, but they're not available everywhere. They're not available everywhere because there's legislation. So in Europe, we had something called the 2001 Gmo Directive. And the 2001 Gmo Directive did judge genetic engineering not by the outcome, but by the technology itself. So if I told you I have this great machine that makes food, you would be maybe skeptical towards the food that comes out of it, but you would say, okay, this apple that came out of it, is that apple safe? What the European Union has tried to do is to look at the machine itself and say, what can we derive from the machine itself towards all the food that it produces? And therefore has judged that the machine itself is too dangerous, that genetic engineering is too dangerous as itself, by the precautionary principle, and has outlawed it completely. So it doesn't look at the results, it looks only at the technology itself. And that's why Europe has actually fallen behind quite a bit. And fallen behind, we've actually analyzed this together with researchers, PhD researchers from the Genetic Literacy Project. And if you click on the chat box, you see our first gene editing regulatory index, where you can actually click on it and compare your region to other regions in the world. And what we've done is we looked at the regulation and the availability for research on genetic engineering, and looked at how available is it, how open is it for consumers. Because I think this is an important message to send to free marketeers, because when we talk about our freedom, we can look at it from the perspective on, like, what does the government allow us to do? And when we in the Consumer Choice Center look at lifestyle regulation, of course, that this is something that we look at all the time. Like, what available products are there on the market? How much does the government allow me to have this? Right? So this is availability and like, how much restriction do I have towards buying it? But freedom can also, like, you can have more freedom in your life through technological innovation. We've actually even noted that scientific innovation has allowed us to develop differently socially. And there's a bunch of examples towards that. I mean, just take our elongated lifespan. There would be no conversation socially about respecting our elders if this was still the Middle Ages, where people only get to the age of 35. We wouldn't have a conversation about respecting our elders if there were no elders. It was only through scientific innovation that we were able to get to a point to live this long and fight all these common diseases. And what we're trying to do is allow, through a reduced regulation, for the scientists and the entrepreneurs of the future to allow us to innovate. And this includes the field of agriculture. We have a lot of talk about increasing populations and how we're going to feed the world. How are we going to deal with natural phenomena? How are we going to deal with the effects of climate change? Because while the debate on climate change can be diverse, we do realize that in some regions of the world, there is problems with droughts and there's problems with floods. And how can scientific innovation allow us to get to a point where we can feed everyone at an acceptable price and actually have exchange? Because I'm originally from Luxembourg, and in Luxembourg it does rain a lot and the winters can get a bit cold. So there's no such thing as Luxembourgish tomatoes. Now the environmentalists are telling me that I should not have tomatoes from Spain because tomatoes from Spain need to be flown in and that's not good for the environment. I would like a situation where everybody can be happy and pleased, that both the environmentalist side can be comforted in their worry that the environment is going down the drain, so that we are able to produce food more energy efficient for more people at a more acceptable price, and that everybody can be happy. And we can do that. We can do that. I believe in the great minds of the world to be able to make that happen. With gene editing, gene editing to me is the most striking example of a scientific innovation that we should constantly talk about how amazing it is, because we can already cure cancers with it. We can create the most amazing foods and do amazing stuff scientifically with it. But nobody's talking about it because on one hand, we either caught up in all the worries about it, even though there has been a lot of scientific evaluation about the safety of it already. And on the other side, we are more concerned about the political he said, she said, and the political party conversation of the day. And I think if we do that, we ignore the immense capabilities that our human species can actually develop. And I'm not sure exactly how much time I have left, but my colleagues have posted 2 links already that are very interesting for you to check out. Now, the mycotoxin paper is more specifically about Europe, but the gene editing regulatory index is international, where you can actually compare all your regions with others, and maybe even use, if you have the opportunity to talk to policymakers in your region, to talk to them and say like, hey, so why is it exactly that Australia is falling behind, and what could Australia do more to advance in these areas? Or, for instance, whenever an environmentalist is saying, yes, we need to ban all these pesticides, for instance, you could say, well, look, I saw this paper on mycotoxins. Mycotoxins are a real problem for consumer health. I think we should do something about it. Either we continue allowed to use these chemicals, or we use modern technology that can actually help us get rid of these environmental problems to begin with. So a lot of tools that we are able to provide to you all. I think, don't want to bore you too much about agriculture, even though it is an important factor. I would just like to say that, first of all, I would like to thank both Maria and Fabio for being here today and laying out some of the very, very important and interesting aspects of their recent work. I would also like to say that you can, of course, follow us on social media and the website. On our website, by the way, if you're in your local community, there's a new regulation coming in, there's a new law, you can send us tips, you can reach us on all of our channel and send us your examples. We have been able to have some significant policy successes. We've been able to stop quite a few rules across the world. We've been able to stop some regulation from happening. Now, of course, it is tedious work. It is a bit of trying to stitch it up as we go along. Sometimes the rules are coming in and we stop them, but that is what we're able to do. We're not able to reform the entire system, but we're doing our little bit to have consumers have as much choice and information as possible, because our slogan and our vision is responsible consumers on the free market making their own choices. So I think that would be sort of in conclusion. I'm not sure if I went over time or have still time left, but in any way, thank you so much for joining this session and for being a part of it. And hopefully you'll be able to hear more from us in the future.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you everyone for joining. Please reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you, everyone. And also, if you have any questions, Bill already mentioned our website. You can contact us. You can send us an email, tweet, anything that you would like to know about the Consumer Choice Center. We are always available.
Actually, I do see one question here from a bit earlier. It's about agriculture in Europe, and it says, does the agricultural industry primarily survive in Europe due to subsidization? Yes. I mean, generally, yes, that is the answer to it. We have something called the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, which subsidizes farmers with direct payments. And this is really just checks giving to farmers. Now, it has had some very perverse effects. Some of the biggest recipients of agricultural subsidies in Europe have been Frankfurt Airport and the Queen of England, because they have so much land that they're actually not using, to keep the prices high. So there have been some of these perverse effects, and Europe is actually way more protectionist than it would like itself to seem. It has been very clearly very protectionist towards countries in Africa, and it does that through different means of protectionism. So one of the means is subsidization, where it gives money to farmers. The other thing is that it has very high food standards. So the compliance cost for a farmer to export to Europe is actually really high, and to some farmers this is not an availability. And third of all, there is of course tariffs, the classic tariff system. So just one anecdote of one of the very perverse effects of the agriculture policy in Europe is that I was talking to a member of parliament in the European Parliament, and he said he was traveling to Burkina Faso in Africa to observe an election or something, and he said he was in an hotel and he ordered vegetable soup, and they said, sorry, we don't have vegetable soup today because the plane from France didn't arrive. We subsidize our farmers so much in Europe that they are able to export to Africa and so sell below the local market prices. So we're essentially bankrupting local farmers in Africa for the purpose of sustaining our own agricultural system. And I think this is one of the most evil effects of some of these policies. So yeah, this is a long answer to a short question. But thank you for that, and